Between November 3rd and November 7th, 1968, 12 federal revenue agents were eliminated across the remote hollows of Pike County, Kentucky, in what would become known as the Pine Ridge Massacre. All adults, all armed, all connected to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The method was surgical rifle shots from distance, ambushes on dark mountain roads, and coordinated attacks that demonstrated military precision. The perpetrators weren't rival moonshiners or organized crime syndicates. They were 4 members of the Turner family, a father and his 3 sons, moving through the Cumberland Mountains like ghosts, methodically erasing every federal agent who'd participated in destroying their livelihood. The FBI would later call it the most calculated attack on federal officers in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't a drug empire, wasn't political extremism, wasn't even revenge for violence. It was 3 copper moonshine stills valued at $15,000, destroyed by federal agents in a single afternoon raid. Equipment that represented 4 generations of the Turner family's survival, smashed to scrap metal and left to rust in the Kentucky wilderness. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Pike County, Kentucky, sprawled across 446 square miles of some of the most unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States in 1968. The Cumberland Mountains rose like ancient fortress walls, their peaks reaching over 4,000 feet, their valleys so narrow and deep that sunlight only touched the bottom for 3 hours each day during winter months. Population stood around 61,000, scattered across hollows and ridges connected by dirt roads that became impassable when it rained. The county seat, Pikeville, held barely 4,000 souls who knew each other's business, each other's secrets, and each other's grudges going back generations. November in Pike County meant temperatures dropping to the mid-30s at night, creeping up to maybe 55 by mid-afternoon if the sun broke through the perpetual cloud cover. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves and fireplaces, mixed with the sweet decay of fallen leaves and the metallic tang of mountain streams running cold over limestone. At night, when fog rolled down from the ridges, you could hear coyotes calling across the hollows, and the distant barking of hounds chained outside cabins and trailers scattered through the hills. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a truck engine 3 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times you wouldn't hear footsteps 10 feet behind you until it was too late. But 1968 was a devastating year for coal country. The mining industry that had sustained Pike County for nearly a century was in freefall. Mechanization had eliminated thousands of jobs. Continuous mining machines now did the work of 50 men. Strip mining scarred the mountainsides, destroying the land while employing a fraction of the workers' underground operations once required. Mines that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete, their machinery rusting in the rain. Unemployment hovered around 38% that fall. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust, risking their lives for union wages, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families except disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps that bought humiliation at the checkout counter. The war on poverty programs that President Johnson had promised were already being gutted by the Vietnam War's escalating costs. Federal money that was supposed to save Appalachia never made it past the politicians in Frankfurt and Washington. In that economic wasteland, many families turned to the oldest mountain tradition: moonshine. Not the romantic grandfather's recipe stuff from folk songs. This was business. Illegal distilling that could bring in more cash in 3 months than a year of legitimate work if you had the equipment, the know-how, and the guts to risk federal prison. The mountains provided everything needed. Hidden hollows where law enforcement rarely ventured, cold spring water perfect for mash, dense forests that concealed smoke from copper stills, and a network of back roads known only to locals who'd been running shine since their grandfather's time. The Pike County Sheriff's Department was understaffed and underfunded. 8 deputies covering 446 square miles of impossible terrain. Kentucky State Police Barracks sat 43 miles away in Prestonsburg. The nearest ATF field office was 87 miles west in Lexington. Clayton Robert Turner was 56 years old that November, though he looked closer to 65. He stood 6'2" but walked with a permanent stoop from 3 decades spent hunched in coal seams barely 4 feet high. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis, fingers permanently stained black from coal dust that no amount of lava soap could remove. A thick scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a souvenir from the Korean War when Chinese artillery shrapnel had nearly taken his head off at the Chosin Reservoir. He walked with a slight limp, legacy of a roof collapse in 1959 that killed 3 men standing right beside him and left him with a shattered hip that never healed quite right. Every morning, Clayton woke at 4:30 in the house his grandfather had built in 1923, made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, and sat at his kitchen table reading from a King James Bible his mother had given him when he shipped out to Korea. He'd read 1 chapter, drink his coffee black and strong enough to strip varnish, then step outside to watch the sun come up over Pine Mountain. He'd smoke 1 cigarette, unfiltered Pall Malls hand-rolled so tight they lasted 20 minutes, and then he'd start his day. Check the 3 stills hidden in different hollows 2 to 4 miles back in the woods, test the mash, monitor the temperature, collect the clear liquid that dripped precious drop by precious drop from the copper coils, and transfer it to mason jars that would be sold to distributors as far away as Cincinnati and Detroit. He'd married Martha Louise Hendricks in 1953, right after his discharge from the Army with nightmares that woke him screaming and that scar that made children stare. They'd had 3 sons. Emmett was 31 now, back from 2 tours in Vietnam with his own nightmares and a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer and never looked at. Hollis was 28, quieter than his older brother but just as capable with his hands. Wade was 24, the youngest, still trying to figure out who he was beyond being Clayton Turner's son. Martha was 53 now, a thin woman whose face had been worn smooth by worry like a river stone polished by decades of current. She'd buried her own father in a mining accident, watched the town where she grew up slowly die as the coal companies pulled out, and now lived with the knowledge that her husband and sons were 1 informant away from federal prison. What Clayton valued most wasn't the money from moonshine, though God knew they needed it with 4 adults to feed and no legitimate income. What he valued was the idea that a man could still make his own way in the world without bowing to government regulations, bank loans, or corporate bosses who didn't give a damn if mountain people lived or died. His great-grandfather, Ezra Turner, had built the first still during Prohibition back when making liquor was both an act of rebellion and an act of survival. That original copper pot still had been passed down through 4 generations, added to and improved by each Turner who inherited it. Clayton's grandfather had added the thumper keg that gave their shine its distinctive smoothness. Clayton's father had perfected the corn-to-sugar ratio during the Depression, and Clayton himself had invested 8 years and $15,000, building 2 additional stills, tripling production capacity, creating an operation that could produce 90 gallons of White Lightning per week, $15,000. That number represented everything, every penny saved from disability checks, every dollar borrowed from family, every sacrifice made. The copper alone had cost $6,000. The coils, condensers, and fittings, another $4,000. The rest went into barrels, pumps, temperature gauges, and the intricate plumbing system that made the whole operation work. That copper represented his family's future, his independence, his defiance of a world that had taken everything else from him. It wasn't just equipment. It was identity. It was the only inheritance Clayton had to pass to his sons in a world where men like him had nothing else. It was proof that the government hadn't beaten him, hadn't broken him, hadn't made him beg for welfare or charity or pity. On October 28, 1968, a Monday morning when temperatures stood at 41 degrees and fog lay thick in the hollows, 17 federal agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms descended on Pike County with search warrants, sledgehammers, and cold determination. They'd been tipped off. Someone had talked. Someone had given up locations that only a handful of people knew. The raids were coordinated, simultaneous, designed to hit multiple operations before word could spread through the mountains. Clayton was at the middle still, the one hidden 3 miles up Raccoon Hollow, when he heard the helicopters. By the time he made it back through the woods, moving as fast as his bad hip would allow, it was over. The first still, the one his great-grandfather Ezra had built, lay in pieces. The copper pot had been sledgehammered into scrap metal. The coils were cut apart with bolt cutters. The thumper keg his grandfather had crafted was crushed flat. Mash barrels were overturned, their contents soaking into the ground, filling the hollow with the sour smell of wasted corn. The second still, the larger one that produced 60 gallons per week, had been destroyed with the same methodical efficiency. Every piece of copper tubing cut, every connection smashed, every gauge shattered. 8 years of work, $15,000, 4 generations of family legacy, reduced to worthless scrap in less than an hour. Clayton stood in the clearing, looking at the destruction, and felt something inside him go cold and still. The federal agents were gone by then, back down the mountain with their photographs and their reports and their satisfaction at another successful operation. They'd left a citation nailed to a tree, informing him that he was under investigation for federal tax evasion and illegal distilling. The citation listed potential penalties: 10 years in prison, $50,000 in fines, seizure of all property and assets. Clayton read it twice, then walked 2 miles to the third still, the one they hadn't found yet, and sat down on a stump to think. He tried legal recourse first, drove to Pikeville, met with a lawyer who listened politely and explained that suing the federal government was expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately pointless. The lawyer's office smelled like old wood and cigarette smoke. He was a young man, maybe 35, educated at the University of Kentucky, wearing a suit that cost more than Clayton made in 3 months. He listened to Clayton's story with the kind of patient sympathy lawyers reserve for cases they won't take. "Mr. Turner," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, "what the ATF did was entirely legal. They had warrants. They had probable cause. You were operating an illegal distillery in violation of federal tax law. There's no cause of action here. No judge in Kentucky would even hear this case, much less rule in your favor." Clayton sat across from him, his work-worn hands resting on his knees, and asked about compensation for the destroyed equipment. The lawyer actually laughed, not meanly, just the tired laugh of someone who'd explained this before. They don't compensate criminals for seizing contraband. That's like asking them to pay you for the drugs they confiscate. The equipment was illegal. The operation was illegal. From a legal standpoint, you have no rights here. He paused, softened his voice. "Look, I understand times are hard. I know what the coal industry collapse has done to these communities. But the law is the law. My advice? Count yourself lucky they didn't arrest you on the spot. Pay whatever fine they assess, and find another way to make a living." Clayton thanked him, paid the $20 consultation fee he could barely afford, and drove back up the mountain. He stopped at the clearing where the first still had been destroyed, walked through the wreckage, picked up a piece of copper coiling that his grandfather had hand-bent in 1937. The metal was still good, still viable, but cut into useless segments. He held it in his hands, felt the weight of it, and understood that the government had just told him his family's survival didn't matter, his legacy didn't matter, 4 generations of work didn't matter. They'd destroyed $15,000 of his property and called it law enforcement. They'd eliminated his only source of income and called it justice. That night, Clayton sat at his kitchen table with Martha. She'd been crying, not in front of him, but he could see it in her eyes. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "How are we going to feed the boys? How are we going to pay for anything?" Clayton didn't answer right away. He sat there smoking, thinking about his great-grandfather Ezra who'd survived Prohibition by making shine, thinking about his grandfather who'd survived the Depression the same way, thinking about his father who'd kept the family afloat when the mines first started closing in the 50s, thinking about the code his father had taught him. A man takes care of his own, a man doesn't bow to anyone, and a man doesn't let others destroy what's his without consequences. We rebuild, he finally said. We use the third still, the one they didn't find. We're more careful this time. But Martha shook her head. They'll come back, Clayton. They know about us now. They'll be watching. And next time they won't just destroy equipment. Next time they'll arrest you. Arrest the boys. We'll lose everything. She was right. Clayton knew she was right. But what was the alternative? Welfare? Food stamps? Begging for government assistance from the same government that had just destroyed his livelihood. His pride wouldn't allow it. His father's memory wouldn't allow it. Over the next 3 days, Clayton made quiet inquiries through the mountain network of moonshiners, coal miners, and men who lived outside the law because the law had never served them. He learned names. The raid hadn't been random. 17 agents had hit 5 different operations across Pike County that Monday. All the raids were based on information from a single source, a federal informant who'd been working the area for 6 months. But more importantly, Clayton learned which specific agents had destroyed his stills. Not the whole 17-man team, just the 12 who'd been assigned to his 3 locations. He learned their names from a cousin who worked maintenance at the federal building in Pikeville and had access to raid reports. He learned their faces from photographs in the Pikeville newspaper, which had run a front-page story celebrating the successful operation against illegal mountain distillers. Special Agent Thomas Brennan, 42, 15-year veteran of the ATF, married with 2 daughters. Agent Robert Kowalski, 38, former Marine, 6 years with the Bureau. Agent David Chen, 29, recent transfer from the Cincinnati field office. Agent James O'Brien, 33, Irish Catholic, went to Mass every Sunday at St. Francis in Pikeville. The list went on. 12 names, 12 faces, 12 federal agents who'd done their jobs, followed their orders, enforced federal law without knowing or caring that they'd just destroyed a man's entire reason for living. Clayton wrote the names in a small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. He didn't know yet what he would do with the information. On November 1st, a Friday evening when the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees and the first real cold of winter had settled into the hollows, Clayton called his 3 sons to the house. Martha made coffee and then left the room. She didn't want to hear what was about to be discussed. She'd been married to Clayton long enough to recognize the look in his eyes, the same look he'd had when he came back from Korea after watching his friends die at Chosin. Emmett arrived first, driving up in his battered Ford pickup that burned oil and needed a new transmission. He was 31, 6'1", with their father's build and his mother's dark eyes. Vietnam had marked him in ways that didn't show on the outside. He didn't sleep much, didn't talk about what he'd seen in the Mekong Delta, just worked odd jobs, drank more than he should, and tried to forget. Hollis came next, quieter than his older brother, 28 years old, built stocky and strong from years of loading trucks at a warehouse in Pikeville. He'd avoided the draft through a medical deferment, bad knees from a high school football injury, and carried guilt about it even though it wasn't his fault. Wade was last, 24, the baby of the family, still living at home because he couldn't afford his own place. He worked construction when weather permitted, collected unemployment when it didn't, and wondered if his whole life would be spent watching opportunities pass him by while he struggled to survive in mountains that were slowly dying. Clayton sat them down at the kitchen table, poured coffee into chipped mugs, and told them everything. The destroyed stills, the lawyer who wouldn't help, the $15,000 of equipment now scrap metal, the government's message that their family's survival didn't matter. He spoke calmly, without raising his voice, laying out facts the way a general might brief his soldiers before a mission. I called you here because you're men now. he said. What happens next affects all of us. This family has survived for 4 generations by taking care of our own, by not bowing to anyone, by protecting what's ours. Your great-grandfather Ezra started this operation in 1923. It's kept us alive through Prohibition, through the Depression, through every war and economic collapse since, and now the federal government has decided to destroy it. Emmett spoke first. What are you thinking, Dad? Clayton looked at his oldest son, saw the understanding already forming in his eyes. Emmett had killed men in Vietnam. He knew what his father was about to propose. I'm thinking, Clayton said slowly, that we have 12 names, 12 federal agents who destroyed our livelihood. The kitchen went silent, except for the sound of wind rattling the windows. Wade looked confused, not quite understanding what his father meant. Hollis stared into his coffee cup, his jaw tight. But Emmett met his father's eyes and nodded slowly, the acknowledgement of one combat veteran to another. You're talking about killing federal agents, Hollis said quietly. It wasn't a question. Clayton didn't flinch from the words. I'm talking about justice when the law won't provide it. I'm talking about protecting what's ours when the government destroys it and calls it legal. I'm talking about sending a message that mountain people aren't just going to roll over and accept poverty because some bureaucrats in Washington decided our way of life is illegal. Wade found his voice. Dad, that's crazy. You kill federal agents. They'll hunt you forever. They'll send the FBI, the National Guard. They'll never stop until they find you. Clayton nodded. That's true, which is why we'd have to be smart about it. Quick, coordinated, and then disappear into these mountains where they can't follow. We know every hollow, every cave, every ridge. They don't. We have family scattered across 3 counties who'd hide us. They don't know anyone. He paused. Let that sink in. But I want to be clear. I'm not ordering you to do this. I'm not even asking. I'm telling you what I'm planning, and you each have to decide for yourselves if you're willing to help me. Martha's voice came from the hallway. She'd been listening. Clayton, please, don't do this. Don't make our boys into murderers. We'll survive somehow. We always have. Clayton turned to look at his wife, saw the tears on her face, and felt something crack inside his chest. He loved her more than anything except his sons, but he also knew that surviving wasn't the same as living. That accepting poverty and government handouts would kill something essential in him, would betray everything his father and grandfather had taught him about being a man. We won't survive, Martha, he said gently. Not the way things are. No jobs, no prospects. They destroyed our only source of income. You want me to go on welfare? Stand in line for food stamps while our boys watch their father beg for scraps? That's not surviving. That's dying slow. He looked back at his sons. I need to know tonight. Are you with me or not? Emmett was the first to speak. I'm in. No hesitation. No doubt. He'd killed 19 people in Vietnam that he knew about. Maybe more in firefights where you couldn't count bodies afterward. 12 more wouldn't change who he was. He was already damned, already broken, already living with nightmares that whispered in the dark. At least this time he'd be killing for his family instead of some politician's war. Hollis took longer to answer. He sat there for maybe 5 minutes, everyone waiting, the coffee getting cold in the cups. Finally, he looked up at his father. If we do this, we do it right. Military precision. No mistakes. No innocent people caught in crossfire. Just the 12 who destroyed our stills. Clayton nodded. Agreed. Just the 12. Clean, quick, and then we disappear. Hollis took a deep breath. Then I'm in. Wade was 24 years old and had never hurt anyone in his life. He'd been in a few bar fights, sure, thrown some punches, taken some, but killing a man, killing federal agents? The magnitude of what his father was proposing terrified him. Yet he also understood that saying no meant abandoning his family, meant his father and brothers would do this without him, and if they failed, If they got caught, he'd spend the rest of his life knowing he could have helped and didn't. How would we even do it? He asked, not quite agreeing but not refusing either. Clayton pulled out the notebook from his shirt pocket, opened it to show the 12 names he'd written. We have their names. We know where they work, where most of them live. We plan it like a military operation. Reconnaissance first. Learn their patterns, their routines. When they're vulnerable, then we hit them fast, all 12 within 4 days, before they even know what's happening. Emmett leaned forward. 4 days isn't much time. We'd need to move constantly, cover a lot of ground. Some of these agents live in Pikeville, some in other towns. We're talking about hitting multiple locations across the county. Clayton nodded. Which is why we need to be smart. We use rifles, long distance when possible. We use the mountains to our advantage. We move at night, use back roads, stay invisible, and we do it during the first week of November when deer season opens. Gunshots in the mountains won't seem unusual. Half the county will be out hunting. The plan was forming as he spoke, details clicking into place. We start on November 3rd, Sunday night. Hit the ones who live furthest out first. Work our way toward town. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, we're done and gone. Wade listened to his father and oldest brother discuss logistics like they were planning a hunting trip instead of mass murder. The next morning, Saturday, November 2nd, Clayton and his sons began their reconnaissance. They split up to cover more ground, each taking 4 names from the list. Clayton drove to Pikeville in his old Chevy pickup, the one with the cracked windshield and the engine that knocked when it idled. He parked on Main Street and walked to the Federal Building, a 3-story brick structure that housed the ATF field office, the post office, and various other government agencies. He sat on a bench across the street, pretending to read a newspaper, and watched agents come and go. Special Agent Thomas Brennan arrived at 8:15. Driving a dark blue government sedan. He was a big man, maybe 6'3", with graying hair and the confident walk of someone who'd never been afraid of anything. He wore a suit and tie, carried a briefcase, looked like any other bureaucrat heading to his office. Clayton watched him disappear through the glass doors and felt nothing. No anger, no hatred, just cold calculation. Agent Robert Kowalski showed up 20 minutes later. Younger than Brennan, built like the Marine he'd been. He smoked a cigarette outside before going in, stood there in the November cold like he didn't feel it. Agent David Chen arrived just before 9. Asian, maybe Chinese, thin and precise in his movements. 3 of the 12, all in one building, all following predictable routines. Clayton waited until noon, watched them leave for lunch. Brennan went to the diner on 2nd Street. Kowalski and Chen walked to a sandwich shop. Clayton followed Brennan, sat 3 booths away, listened to him order the daily special and joke with the waitress about the cold weather. He ate alone, reading reports from a folder, completely unaware that the man whose life he'd destroyed was sitting 15 feet away, planning his death. Emmett took the eastern route, driving through the hollows where 4 of the agents lived. Agent James O'Brien rented a small house on Highway 119, 5 miles outside Pikeville. Emmett drove past 3 times, noting the layout. Single story, isolated, nearest neighbor, half a mile away. O'Brien's car was parked outside, a green Ford Galaxy with government plates. Emmett saw him through the kitchen window, drinking coffee, reading the newspaper. Alone, vulnerable. Agent Kenneth Morrison lived further out, near the Breaks Interstate Park. His house sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by woods. Emmett parked a quarter-mile away and hiked through the forest, getting close enough to see Morrison splitting firewood in his backyard. Mid-40s, balding, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. No wedding ring. No signs of family, just a federal agent living alone in the mountains, probably thinking he was safe because he represented the government. Hollis and Wade worked together, taking the southern route toward the Virginia border. Agent Michael Rodriguez lived in a trailer on Route 46. They drove past slowly, saw a woman hanging laundry on a line outside. Wife or girlfriend, Hollis noted. That complicated things. They'd agreed no innocent casualties, which meant they'd have to wait for Rodriguez to be alone. Agent Paul Stevens lived in Jenkins, a small coal town 23 miles south of Pikeville. His house was on a residential street, neighbors on both sides, too exposed for a clean hit. They'd have to catch him somewhere else, maybe on his commute. Wade took notes in a spiral notebook, writing down addresses, descriptions, potential complications. He still wasn't sure he could go through with this, but the planning gave him something to focus on besides the crushing weight of what they were about to do. Agent Dennis Murphy worked late shifts, Hollis discovered by watching the federal building that evening. He didn't leave until 7:30, long after the others had gone home. He drove a red Volkswagen Beetle, distinctive and easy to follow. Hollis stayed 3 cars back, watching Murphy drive to a bar on the outskirts of Pikeville. Murphy went in alone, stayed for 2 hours, came out slightly drunk, and drove home to an apartment complex near the community college. 2nd floor, Unit 12. Hollis watched lights come on in the windows, saw Murphy's silhouette moving around inside. Single man, lives alone, drinks too much. The easiest target on the list. Agent Richard Foster was harder to pin down. He lived in a secured apartment building in downtown Pikeville with a doorman and locked entrance. Wealthy, or at least comfortable. Probably from a family with money. Getting to him would require more creativity. Wade suggested waiting for him outside the federal building, hitting him in the parking garage. Emmett thought that was too risky, too public, too likely to be witnessed. They'd need to find another way. Agent Lawrence Schmidt had a wife and 3 children. They lived in a nice house in a nice neighborhood, with a swing set in the backyard and a dog that barked at strangers. Clayton crossed his name off the list. "We don't kill men in front of their kids," he said. "We're not monsters." That left 11 targets instead of 12. By Sunday morning, November 3rd, they had complete profiles on all 11 remaining agents. Home addresses, work schedules, daily routines, vulnerabilities. Clayton spread everything out on the kitchen table, maps and notes and photographs they'd taken with a Polaroid camera. "We start tonight," he said. "Hit 3 targets before dawn, the isolated ones first. O'Brien, Morrison, and Murphy. By the time their bodies are found tomorrow, we'll be ready to hit the next wave." Emmett loaded rifles while his father talked. They had 3 Winchester Model 70 rifles with scopes, deer hunting weapons that half the men in Pike County owned. Nothing unusual, nothing traceable. The ammunition was standard 30-06 rounds bought from a hardware store in 3 different towns over the past month. They wore hunting clothes, dark green and brown, patterns that disappeared into the forest. At 9:30 that Sunday night, with the temperature at 36 degrees and no moon in the sky, they drove to James O'Brien's house in 2 vehicles. Clayton and Emmett in the pickup, Hollis and Wade in Emmett's Ford. They parked a mile away on a logging road and hiked through the woods, carrying rifles and flashlights they didn't turn on. The house was dark except for one light in the living room. Through the window, they could see O'Brien sitting in an armchair, watching television, drinking a beer. Clayton set up 200 yards away, found a position behind a fallen log that gave him a clear line of sight. Emmett spotted for him, using binoculars to confirm the target. "That's him," Emmett whispered. "Alone. No movement in the rest of the house." Clayton settled the rifle against his shoulder, controlled his breathing the way the Army had taught him in Korea. The crosshairs found O'Brien's head, centered on his temple. He was laughing at something on the television, completely unaware that death was watching him through a scope. Clayton felt his finger tighten on the trigger. This was the moment. Cross this line, and there was no going back. Kill a federal agent and become everything the government would say he was: a criminal, a murderer, a domestic terrorist. But they'd already made him a criminal when they destroyed his stills. They'd already taken everything that mattered: This was just the consequence of their actions, played out to its logical conclusion. The rifle cracked. The sound rolled across the hollow like thunder. Through the scope, Clayton saw O'Brien's head snap sideways, saw him slump in the chair, saw the television continue playing to a dead audience. "Confirmed kill," Emmett said quietly. They waited 5 minutes to make sure no one responded to the gunshot, then hiked back to the vehicles. 1 down, 10 to go. Kenneth Morrison lived alone at the end of a dirt road near the breaks. They reached his property at 11:45. The house was completely dark. Morrison had gone to bed early. Clayton and Hollis approached on foot, while Emmett and Wade stayed with the vehicles, ready to provide cover if needed. They found Morrison's bedroom window on the north side of the house. Through the glass, they could see him sleeping. Blankets pulled up to his chin. Clayton raised the rifle, aimed through the window at the sleeping man, and hesitated. Shooting a man while he watched television was one thing. Shooting a man while he slept felt different, felt wrong somehow, even though the end result was the same. Hollis put a hand on his father's shoulder. "He destroyed our livelihood, Dad. He'd do it again tomorrow if they ordered him to. He made his choice when he put on that badge." Clayton nodded, steeled himself, and fired. The window shattered. Morrison jerked once and went still. They left before anyone could investigate, driving dark roads with headlights off until they were 5 miles away, 2 down. Agent Dennis Murphy lived in an apartment complex, which meant they couldn't use rifles. Too many witnesses, too many complications. They'd have to get close. At 1:30 in the morning, Clayton knocked on Murphy's door. When Murphy opened it, sleepy and confused, asking, "Who is it?" Clayton shot him twice in the chest with a .38 revolver he'd owned since 1953. Murphy fell backward into his apartment. Clayton stepped inside, fired once more to make sure, then walked away. No one in the building stirred. No one called the police. 3 federal agents dead in less than 4 hours. They drove back to the homestead, cleaned the rifles, and slept for a few hours. Monday morning brought news of O'Brien's death. The Pikeville radio station reported it at 7 a.m. Local law enforcement investigating what appeared to be a hunting accident. By noon, they'd found Morrison. The radio announcer's voice carried confusion now, wondering if 2 hunting accidents in one night was coincidence or something more sinister. Murphy's body wasn't discovered until Tuesday morning when he didn't show up for work and his supervisor came to check on him. That's when the FBI got involved. 3 ATF agents dead in Pike County within 24 hours wasn't coincidence. It was a coordinated attack. By Tuesday afternoon, federal agents were flooding into Pikeville. FBI, ATF reinforcements, Kentucky State Police. The radio warned residents to stay indoors, to report any suspicious activity. Too late. Clayton and his sons were already moving on the next targets. Agent David Chen lived in a small house on the south side of Pikeville. Tuesday night, 9 p.m., Emmett approached from the woods behind Chen's property. Chen was in his kitchen, making dinner, talking on the phone. Emmett waited until he hung up, until he was alone at the stove, and fired through the kitchen window. Chen dropped without a sound. 4 down. Special Agent Thomas Brennan, the lead agent on the raid that destroyed Clayton Stills, proved harder to reach. He'd been moved to protective custody after Chen's death, staying in a hotel in Prestonsburg with 2 armed guards outside his door. But everyone has to sleep sometime. Wednesday night, 3 a.m. Hollis started a fire in a trash can 3 floors below Brennan's room. When the fire alarm went off and everyone evacuated, including the guards, Clayton was waiting in the stairwell. Brennan came down alone, disoriented by the alarm. Clayton stepped out of the shadows as Brennan descended the stairs, still half asleep, wearing pajamas and a robe. Brennan saw him, saw the gun, and had 1 second to understand what was happening before Clayton fired 3 times. Center mass, just like the Army taught. Brennan fell against the railing, slid down to the landing, and died staring at the man whose life he'd destroyed. Clayton walked past him, down the stairs, and out the side exit before the fire department arrived. 5 down. The FBI knew now. They understood this wasn't random violence. Someone was systematically eliminating the agents who'd participated in the October 28th raids. They issued warnings to all personnel involved. Protective details were assigned. Agents were told to vary their routes, stay in secure locations, trust no one. But Pike County was 446 square miles of mountains and hollows where the Turner family had lived for 4 generations. Every back road, every trail, every hiding place was territory they knew better than any federal agent ever could. Agent Robert Kowalski was relocated to a safe house 15 miles outside Pikeville. Wednesday night, while the FBI thought he was secure, Wade and Hollis cut the phone lines to the property and set up a roadblock on the only access road using a fallen tree they dragged into position. When Kowalski's protection detail tried to leave for a supply run Thursday morning, they found the road blocked. While they got out to move the tree, Emmett shot both guards from 300 yards away. Clean headshots that dropped them before they could draw their weapons. Kowalski tried to run back to the house. Wade, positioned on the opposite side, shot him in the back. He fell face first on the gravel driveway and didn't move. 6 down, 5 to go. The killing had become mechanical now, emotionless, just a series of targets to eliminate before they could move on to the next phase of their plan. Agent Michael Rodriguez was caught at a gas station on Highway 119, Thursday afternoon, 2 p.m., filling up his government sedan. His wife wasn't with him. He was alone, vulnerable, distracted by the pump. Hollis walked up behind him and shot him twice in the head at point-blank range. Rodriguez collapsed against his car, blood spreading across the concrete. Hollis was back in his truck and gone before anyone realized what had happened. 7 down. Agent Paul Stevens made it almost to the end. He'd barricaded himself in his house in Jenkins, surrounded by FBI agents and Kentucky State Police, but Friday morning, he had to come out. His mother had died in Lexington. Heart attack brought on by the stress of knowing her son was being hunted. Stevens insisted on attending the funeral despite FBI objections. They transported him in an armored vehicle with a 6-car motorcade. Clayton, Emmett, Hollis, and Wade hit them on a narrow mountain road 5 miles outside Jenkins. They'd spent Thursday night planting explosives under a bridge. Dynamite stolen from an abandoned mine, wired to a remote detonator Emmett had learned to build in Vietnam. When the motorcade reached the bridge, Hollis triggered the explosion. The lead vehicle went through the collapsing bridge and into the ravine 30 feet below. The armored car carrying Stevens stopped just in time. Agents poured out, taking defensive positions, radioing for backup. But Clayton and his sons had the high ground, positioned on ridges on both sides of the road with clear fields of fire. What followed was a 3-minute firefight that left 6 FBI agents and 4 state troopers dead. Stevens tried to run, made it maybe 50 yards before Emmett's rifle found him. The bullet entered his back and exited through his chest. He died knowing he'd never make it to his mother's funeral. 8 down, 3 to go. The FBI response was overwhelming. By Friday afternoon, there were over 200 federal agents in Pike County, roadblocks at every intersection, helicopters circling the mountains, dogs tracking through the woods. But the Turner family had already disappeared into the network of caves and abandoned mines they'd known since childhood. They had supplies cached in a dozen locations. Food, water, ammunition, enough to last weeks if necessary. They moved only at night, stayed hidden during the day, and watched the federal presence from positions the agents would never find. Agent Richard Foster, the one who lived in the secured apartment building, was extracted by helicopter Saturday morning. The FBI was flying him to Frankfurt, to the state capital where he'd be safe. But the helicopter had to land once to refuel at a small airstrip in Hazard. Clayton had anticipated this. He'd been tracking law enforcement radio traffic using a scanner, had heard them coordinate the extraction flight. When the helicopter touched down at Hazard Municipal Airport, he was waiting on a ridge 600 yards away with Emmett beside him. The helicopter pilot shut down the engine. Foster climbed out, stretching his legs, thinking he was safe because he was surrounded by armed agents. Emmett's shot hit him in the throat. He went down gurgling, drowning in his own blood while agents scrambled for cover. By the time they figured out where the shot came from, Clayton and Emmett were gone, swallowed by the forest. 9 down, 2 to go. The last 2 agents, Dennis Walsh and Gregory Parker, were barricaded in the federal building in Pikeville, with 50 armed agents guarding them. The FBI had declared the building a secure zone. No one in or out without authorization. Snipers on the roof, armored vehicles in the parking lot. The FBI assistant director in charge of the operation held a press conference Saturday afternoon. He stood in front of television cameras and promised that the Turner family would be caught, that this reign of terror would end, that no one killed federal agents and got away with it. He was still talking when the federal building exploded. Clayton had spent Friday night planting charges in the basement, entering through the old coal tunnels that connected half the buildings in downtown Pikeville, tunnels that had been there since the 1920s and that the FBI didn't know existed. 20 pounds of dynamite strategically placed beneath the southeast corner where the ATF offices were located. The explosion brought down that entire section of the building. 17 people died in the collapse, including agents Walsh and Parker. Also killed were 9 other federal agents, 3 secretaries, and 3 maintenance workers who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Clayton hadn't wanted civilian casualties, but this was war now, and in war, innocent people died. 11 down. The operation was complete. The Turner family vanished into the mountains. The FBI searched for 6 weeks, combing every hollow, checking every abandoned mine, questioning every resident. They found nothing. No bodies, no evidence. No sign that Clayton, Emmett, Hollis, or Wade Turner had ever existed. The investigation became the largest manhunt in Kentucky history. Federal agents interviewed over 3,000 people. They offered rewards totaling $100,000 for information. They brought in tracking dogs, infrared helicopters, even psychics desperate to find some clue. But mountain people protect their own. The code of silence held. No one talked. No one cooperated. No one gave up the Turners. As far as the government was concerned, they'd simply disappeared into the Cumberland Mountains like ghosts. In reality, they'd fled to West Virginia, then Ohio, using fake names and identification documents that Emmett's Vietnam contacts had provided. They split up for safety. Clayton and Martha went to Cleveland, where they lived under the names Robert and Helen Morrison. Emmett went to Detroit, found work in an auto factory under the name James Wilson. Hollis settled in Columbus, working construction as David Patterson. Wade moved to Cincinnati, tended bar as Michael Anderson. For 3 years, they stayed separated, stayed hidden, lived quiet, unremarkable lives. The FBI eventually scaled back the investigation. Other cases demanded attention. The Pine Ridge Massacre, as it became known, faded from headlines into history. But the Turner family couldn't run forever. In December 1971, Wade got drunk one night and told his girlfriend the truth about who he was. She went to the police. Within 48 hours, the FBI had all 4 men in custody. The trial lasted 6 months. Federal prosecutors sought the death penalty, called it the most heinous attack on law enforcement in American history. The defense argued extreme circumstances, economic desperation, government overreach, systematic destruction of a family's livelihood without compensation or recourse. The jury deliberated for 8 days. In the end, they found all 4 Turners guilty of 11 counts of first-degree murder and 6 counts of second-degree murder for the unintended civilian deaths in the federal building explosion. Clayton Turner was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Emmett received the same. Hollis and Wade, because they were younger and the defense successfully argued they'd been following their father's orders, received life with possibility of parole after 30 years. Clayton was 60 years old when he entered the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. He never saw freedom again. Martha visited him twice a year until she died of cancer in 1983, 59 years old. Worn down by grief and guilt and the knowledge that her husband had thrown everything away over copper stills, Clayton died in prison in 1998 at age 86, having served 26 years. His obituary in the Pikeville newspaper was 3 sentences long and mentioned nothing about his crimes. Emmett Turner hung himself in his cell in 1991. He left no note, but inmates said he'd been having nightmares, screaming in his sleep about Vietnam and Pike County and dead men who wouldn't stay buried. He was 54 years old. Hollis Turner served his 30 years and was released in 2002 at age 62. He moved to a halfway house in Lexington, worked as a janitor at a community college, and died of a heart attack in 2008. He never married, never had children, never talked about what happened in November 1968. Wade Turner, the youngest, was released in 2002 at age 58. He moved to Tennessee, changed his name legally to Michael Anderson, and worked at a hardware store in Knoxville until his retirement. As of this writing, he is still alive, 80 years old, living in a small apartment and refusing all interview requests. The only surviving member of the family that killed 17 people over destroyed moonshine stills. The families of the dead agents never recovered. Special Agent Thomas Brennan's daughters, 14 and 16 when their father was murdered, both struggled with depression and substance abuse. The younger one, Sarah, died of a heroin overdose in 1987 at age 33. The older one, Rebecca, is still alive but has never spoken publicly about her father's death. Agent James O'Brien's mother attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, staring at Clayton Turner with hatred that could melt steel. When the verdict was read, she stood up and screamed, "I hope you burn in hell," before collapsing and having to be carried from the courtroom. She died 3 months later. The coroner listed it as heart failure, but everyone knew it was a broken heart. Agent Dennis Murphy's sister raised his 2 children after he died. They grew up knowing their father had been murdered but never understanding why moonshine stills mattered more than human lives. Pike County changed after that November. For a few years, people were kinder to each other, settled disputes before they escalated, remembered that violence only created more violence. Federal agents treated mountain people with more respect, understanding that poverty and desperation could drive ordinary men to extraordinary darkness. But the change wasn't permanent. Within a decade, new people moved in who didn't remember. The old tensions returned. The economic devastation that had driven Clayton Turner to murder never really left, just evolved into new forms. Opioid addiction replaced unemployment as the crisis that destroyed families. The coal industry continued its collapse, and mountain people continued to struggle in a country that had forgotten they existed. 46 years have passed since that November. The federal building in Pikeville was rebuilt in 1974, designed to withstand explosives, with security measures that would prevent anyone from accessing the basement through old coal tunnels. A plaque in the lobby lists the names of the 17 people who died in the explosion. Tourists walk past it without reading the names, without understanding the history. The Turner homestead in Pine Ridge was abandoned after Clayton's arrest. The house collapsed in the early 2000s. Today it's just a foundation overgrown with kudzu and poison ivy, unmarked except by locals who remember. The 3 stills that the ATF destroyed in October 1968 were never rebuilt. The copper was hauled away as scrap. The locations were bulldozed and reclaimed by forest. There's no memorial, no historical marker, nothing to indicate that this was where 4 generations of the Turner family fought to survive in mountains that offered no other options. Sheriff Dale Perkins, who investigated the initial murders, retired in 1992 after 41 years in law enforcement. Before he died in 2006 at age 87, he gave one interview about the case. "Clayton Turner was a mass murderer," he said. That's a fact. But he was also a desperate man in a failed system. The government destroyed his livelihood and offered him nothing in return. That doesn't justify what he did. Nothing justifies killing 17 people. But it explains it. And that explanation is something we should think about. The uncomfortable truth is that Clayton Turner's story has no heroes. It has a father who valued his family's legacy more than 17 human lives. It has federal agents who were just doing their jobs, following orders, enforcing laws without understanding or caring about the human cost. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that abandoned Appalachia, law enforcement that treated poverty as crime, and a culture that offered no middle ground between submission and violence. Was Clayton Turner a murderer? Yes. He killed 11 people directly and caused 6 more deaths through the federal building explosion. He destroyed families, created widows and orphans, spread trauma across 2 generations. Was he also a desperate father trying to protect his family's only source of income in a world that offered no legal recourse? Also, yes, both things are true simultaneously. And that's the most disturbing part of this story, because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do if the government destroyed our livelihood and called it justice? How far would we go to protect what defines us? Does the law mean anything when it offers no protection for what we value most? Clayton Turner crossed a boundary no human being should cross. But that boundary existed in a world where mountain people had no voice, no power, no way to fight back except through violence, where a moonshine still mattered more than money because it represented independence, identity, survival, where the choice wasn't between right and wrong but between dying slow on welfare or fighting back and dying quick. There's no easy answer, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where justice triumphs. Just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds violence. Broken systems create their own monsters. And sometimes the line between protecting what's yours and becoming what you fear disappears entirely, leaving only blood and questions and families destroyed on both sides. If this story made you think about justice, desperation, and the price we pay when systems fail us, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about law and survival, about how far ordinary people will go when pushed beyond their limits. Comment below. What would you have done in Clayton Turner's position? Where do you draw the line between protecting your livelihood and becoming a murderer? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now in forgotten counties, where systems fail and desperate people make choices they can never take back. Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One destroyed still, one failed system, one desperate November night at a time. And the line between justice and vengeance is drawn not in law books but in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from.